Hello, everyone, and welcome to another fun segment of Lore You Should Know. I'm Greg Tito.
And I'm Chris Perkins.
And we're here to talk about a little bit of Dungeons & Dragons lore for you to get inside your brain pan and hopefully use in your game, or just because it's fun to know these things. Mm-hmm. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that is in Eberron, Rising from the Last War. It's actually in that title. Can you guess what it is? It's not Eberron. It's the Last War. Or not, it's not Rising.
It's not Rising.
It's not Yeast. How does yeast work in well, no, never mind. So, yes, we're going to be talking about the Last War and what that means for fans of Eberron. So, Last War implies that there were many wars in Eberron. Is that true?
There have been a few, yes.
And this is the most worst, terrible one. And in my mind, it feels analogous to how people in our world described the Great World War, which was called the War to End All Wars, World War I.
Yes, and the Last War is an analog for World War I. And it was essentially a conflict between the remnants of a splintered kingdom, the kingdom of Galifar. What happened was the king died, and his 5 children couldn't come to an agreement about who should sit on the throne. And so they went off and waged war against each other that lasted nearly a century until it was finally ended with an event called the Mournland, which I think we've talked about before.
Yes, yeah, when we talked
about
the Lord of
cataclysmic
Blades.
Event that wiped one of those 5 nations off the face of Corvair.
So the entire Last War itself lasted a century?
Just shy of a century, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. It ended, I think, 2 years before the standard start date to most Eberron campaigns. And so it's very fresh in the minds of the people of the nations of Onder, Breland, Karnath, and Thrain, the 4 surviving nations.
And, there have been events like that in the real world here on Earth with things like the 100 Years' War and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But that had lots of ebbs and flows within it. Was this a similar war?
It was because it had essentially 5 participants, all of whom were self-serving. It had many fronts on many different borders and many different battlefields. And the tensions, there would always be tension, but it might be a battle or a war being fought somewhere else. Karnath versus Thrain, Karnath versus Breland, Onder versus Thrain, Breland versus Onder.
Yeah.
Everybody was jabbing each other essentially with spears to death. Slowly, and there was never any alliance between them. Like, you never saw Onder teaming up with Breland really to fight Thrain, although they might surreptitiously be applying pressure to Thrain's borders at the same time. Everybody was out for themselves.
Like any good war gamer, you might think like, oh, now's my time because they're occupied over on this front.
There may have been some like game of Risk shenanigans going on where 2 players were basically conspiring to end a third, but there
were no large alliances between
no
any
lasting
of those
alliances,
5.
No. But it was very much there was lots of espionage in addition to just the Last War wasn't simply forces on borders beating the crap out of each other until one army was wiped out and the other one was forced to retreat or whatever. There were all kinds of espionage things going on, magical conflicts. Breland has these things called the Flying Citadels, these gigantic floating castles essentially that served as mobile garrisons for their troops, whereas Onder had flying towers. Karnath had, of course, the nerve to raise armies of the dead so that they wouldn't have to send their people into battle. They could send their corpses into battle instead. So they all fought the war in their own way, and at different times it sort of teetered, or the advantage seemed to shift from one nation to another depending on the year.
And because there was 5 participants, there would be many of those momentum shifts.
Correct. And I should mention that this battle played out on the continent of this war played out on the continent of Corvair, which also includes other areas. Those 5 nations did not dominate the entire continent. There were places where other people were living, which were kind of on the fringes of the war and may have felt some of it, but they weren't on the front lines. But often they'd get pulled into it, like the corsairs of the Lazar principalities and their ships often played roles in naval skirmishes, or would be hired by, say, Breland to provide shipping and supply lines to get around the enemy, things like that.
Yeah.
So the war pulled in a lot of these outliers. And so even though there were places in Corvair that today would count as nations that didn't have an active role in the war, it feels like they were involved.
Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense.
And there was a lot of like resource scrounging and things like that. And open territory that often would just get in the way. And so, or get used for some warlike purpose, even though it didn't belong to any of the nations in question.
And most of the participants were human-led nations, is that right?
Correct. Yes.
So what
Kingdom
about,
of Galifar was a humanocentric kingdom.
and were there other kingdoms that were more elf-centric or dwarf-centric that would be involved in this? Or
There were non-humans involved. For instance, the Valinor elves, which came up from the island continent of Aeronal originally and laid claim to territory in Corvair, took advantage of the conflict to try to seize more territory for themselves during the war. And so they carved Valinor out. And Valinor elves being very martial and also made great mercenaries, cavalry, send them, basically pay them to do some bloody work. But then you had to watch out because they would turn around and snatch the territory that they'd claimed for themselves.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. So interesting. It wasn't, even though it's a human-centric war, there were all these different factions and different races you played part.
And the dwarves of the Maror holds, they were instrumental in the war because of the resources that they could provide, and because in a sense they were the safe guardians of the currency of the realm, the coin of the realm, the minting of the protecting of it, the distribution of it, things like that. So they tried to be neutral in the conflict, but you know how that goes.
Yeah.
You lean on somebody enough, they'll give you what you want. And so a lot of them got pulled into the espionage.
And especially since this war lasted for so long, there was definitely periods where they might have been working with one nation, and then by the end of that decade, they were working with a different one, and it changed, right?
And then there's the other war that was happening at the same time, and that's the PR war. And so Eberron is fairly advanced in terms of its magical tech. And there are things in Eberron that don't exist in all D&D worlds, like national newspapers and things like the Coranberg Chronicle and the Sharn Inquisitive were tools that the various nations used to turn public sentiment for them and against their enemies. And so there was a lot of that going on. The gnomes of Zilargo, where Coranberg is located, and they got involved in the war through words and also through spying and espionage.
Yeah, so you mentioned that a couple of times. How did that play out for these nations? Was it simply just being able to find out where army movements were going and then being able to attack them, or was it more nefarious than that with assassinations and whatnot?
It was all of the above, and it was things like bringing the press along to watch the brutalities of war, so that you could write a piece that people would read about how unfairly or how brutal the Brelish were, to try to turn King Boronel's own people against him in a way.
And did that happen? Were there revolts that happened throughout
there
this war?
There were within the last war, because it was so long and it's exhausting, and you know how blame often shifts during those types of things.
Yeah.
You start to look for blame everywhere. And there were assassination attempts within nations of their own leaders.
By coup, military leaders trying to take over.
Yeah, renegade military detachments trying to unseat the king in Breland, in Karnath. Political pressure brought to bear against the wizards of Onder, questioning the wisdom of their leaders, dragging them into this conflict.
Yeah.
The fear of losing what you have for the possibility of gaining more is sometimes hard to overcome.
Yeah.
It was also hard because all of these warring nations basically came from the same family and had the same religious underpinnings. So there's sort of a brother against a brother kind of aspect that you can't shake in that situation. We're attacking and killing Thranes, but they worship the sovereign host just like we do. Or they're the Silver Flame. That's a bad example, but this is not us fighting orcs. This is not us fighting giants. This is not us fighting trolls. This is us fighting each other.
Yeah.
All because 2 siblings or 5 siblings couldn't agree on who should sit on a chair.
And that was probably way more true at the beginning of the war.
Yes.
But
once the war goes on, you know how these things go, suddenly the hatred comes in.
Yeah.
This nation destroys this town. You know, Sire attacks Vatheron, a town in Breland, and the Brelish don't get over that.
Yeah.
And those hatreds loom. And then, you know, after Sire is destroyed and becomes the Mournland and all the Siren refugees are displaced, King Boronel says, okay, we can make a home for you in Breland. And his people are going, what the hell? These are our enemies. Why are you giving them a harbor? We should just wipe them off the face of the continent. Those hatreds linger on.
Yeah.
And part of the Eberron campaign is you're not in the war, you're 2 years after the war, dealing with the fallout. Yeah. And some of the fallout is emotional.
I was just going to say, because, if you're talking about a nearly 100 years war, that's 3 or 4 generations of people that have only known their reality as this conflict.
Correct.
And the emotional and psychological toll for an entire people, but also the individuals involved, must have been extreme.
Exactly. And if you're an adventuring party in this time in Eberron's history, the 2 big questions, or 2 of the biggest questions you have to answer are, did you fight in the war? And whether you did or not, who did you lose in the war? Because you probably lost somebody.
Yeah. It's 99 times out of 100, you're going to have some loss that you're dealing with that still feels like an open wound.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's terrifying.
It is. And the thing that distinguishes it, of course, from just a war that we would fight on Earth is the magical component.
Yeah.
And magic was a huge component. It's what gave birth to the Warforged, which were living constructs, basically. We've talked about them in the past.
To my understanding, they were invented, for lack of a better term, during this Great War.
Correct.
When in that 100 years did that occur?
Fairly well in.
Okay.
Essentially decades in. House Cannith, which is one of the dragon-marked houses of Corvair, and we've talked about dragon marks before, but we'll talk about them again. They basically decided to use their magical know-how to forge, if you will, soldiers. For war, soldiers. And they didn't say, we're going to do this for you, Karnath, and nobody else. They said, we'll do it for everybody. And so you have everybody starting to field Warforged armies, and Warforged from the same forge fighting on different sides, potentially against each other.
Yeah.
It was a very canny thing to do, to basically serve as arms brokers for all these nations trying to destroy each other. It's hard to imagine what Cannith's long-term thing is, what their actual goal is there, because it seems kind of counterproductive to make potentially enemies of everybody.
Yeah, it would almost be the equivalent of someone in our real world being like, I'm going to make tanks, and then all of a sudden I'm going to sell tanks to everybody who wants them.
The Chinese, the Russians, the Libyans, the Iranians, the Americans, everybody.
Yeah. Everybody, we're all going to get it at the same time from this independent
our technology can kill anybody.
Yes.
But for Cannith, what it really was we love to invent things, and we want to see if we can do this. It was driven more by the exercise of creating life than worrying, even concerning themselves with what they were ultimately being used for.
How much of the magical technology that is, one of the major underpinnings behind Eberron, how much of that was born by this conflict? So like lightning trains and some of the the galleons and stuff that we have talked about before, Like, were they invented because of this war?
A lot of the transportation technology didn't come about so much from the war, but from the human need to expand, and to prove themselves the most sophisticated, advanced civilization. Human arrogance basically bore those things out.
Okay.
But things like the Warforged, things like the flying citadels, arcane cannons, the Warforged colossi, all of those things were essentially born to help either monopolize or monetize the war or end it.
The reason I'm trying to draw the comparison between, like, how we have, nuclear technology to a certain extent because of the war, or the World War II, or
Yes.
The fact that even the automation of tanks and things like that grew because of World War I and things like that.
If humans didn't feel like if they weren't repelled by the idea of being killed in the Warforged never would have come to be. That's just a clear case of magical technology born out of a fear of just getting killed.
But lightning trains and things like that were already kind of in
they were
use ahead of time?
Those kinds of things were used ahead of time, and then repurposed, I guess you could say, for the war.
That makes sense.
And so, but it's very strange because unlike Kenneth, which didn't seem to have too many moral qualms about giving everybody Warforged, and they justified it by saying, well, they're just Warforged. Who cares if they die? Other dragon-marked houses were less likely to want to get directly involved because their future really was contingent upon them staying above the war. They have a monopoly. They have each dragon-marked house basically has a business monopoly, and they can leverage that during the war, but they don't want to risk losing it or having a nation turn on them.
Right. So. Okay,
so if you're House Orion and you're basically in control of the lightning rail system, and that lightning rail system crosses, at the time, all of the 5 nations, you don't want to be the one responsible for destroying that.
Okay,
you don't want Karnath saying, House Orion has become more of a problem than a benefit to us. We're going to blow up the conductor stones across our nation, because that would have crippled Orion's ability to get from one place to another.
As well as make money off of it.
Exactly.
Right.
So they had to walk a delicate line of neutrality.
So there was 2 hierarchies. There was the national loyalty and the Dragon Mark House loyalty.
Yeah.
That was going on. Of the 5 combative nations, did they have different characters, or were they basically, I don't want to hesitate to say like the good one and the bad one, but like were there ones that were,
The way that we've tried to portray them in lore is to say none of them were evil, universally, but they all did very bad things. And the fact that they're all human, the fact that all this conflict was born out of one family, siblings, a sibling rivalry on a continental scale.
It's like King Lear times 25.
Yeah, exactly. It sort of bears that out. You could say they were all evil. They were all bad. They should have had more sense and just,
killing each other.
Put the oldest one on the throne and be done with it.
Yeah.
Instead, this happened. So they're all to blame. Now, some of them to some extent, they all have something dark under the hood. They're all deeply troubled.
Did they have leaders that, change? Obviously changed throughout the course of it. So one that might have had, a more noble goal early on in the war could be very different by the end of the war.
Right. Yes. And it's hard to really tell the extent to which they were completely in control, right? Because no one person really could guide the war in the direction that they wanted to go. If you're picking up the reins of the war from your father or your mother, you may not even be interested in the war. You might be so fervently angry at how this has come to pass that you think, and arrogant enough to think, that you can make the war play out the way you want it, but it never works out that way.
Interesting. Yeah. So
nobody got what they wanted exactly.
Yeah, so with all this many generations of dealing with this conflict, how could it ever have ended?
Well, it ended in the worst way possible, in effect. And we don't, and we've talked about this before, we deliberately in the campaign don't tell you the cause. But we do say that the war ended the day Sire was destroyed in the magical cataclysm known as the mourning, the day of mourning. The theories of what happened in Sire are all over the map. They range from Sire causing its own self-destruction, essentially with the testing of a weapon that they never got to use against one of their enemies that just went off in
their own territory,
to, hey, this was an outside force, possibly the Lords of Dust or the dragons pushing the world toward the draconic prophecy. It could have been any number of things that caused it. We leave it vague. It could have been a House Cannith Creation Forge disaster. All we know is it's a magical cataclysm. It's left magical after effects, a poisonous fog around the borders of what used to be Sire, random weird magical disturbances, and twisted landscapes within Old Sire itself. So whatever happened, it was clearly a magical incident.
Something that destroyed an entire nation?
Yes. Yeah.
And then once that occurred, all the others were like, whoa,
correct.
We've gone too far.
Well, we have no idea what just happened. And Sire's gone. Who's next? Like, did the gods do this to us? Every question you can imagine is going through their heads. Their agents are trying to figure out what happened. The Sirens are completely collapsed. They assume that one of their enemies just dropped,
all the ones that weren't in the nation at the time,
exactly.
that were in other territories.
Yes.
They're basically homeless now.
Exactly.
And they don't know what happened.
They're headless too because they've lost their queen.
Right.
Because she was in the capital
city. So no
city.
leadership there.
Exactly. So they've been decapitated and they've just experienced a horrific Hiroshima-like, Nagasaki-like event.
So the 4 remaining nations
are like, oh, maybe we should sit around the table and talk about this. And also, I think there was some of the, we didn't do it, right? Right?
Did you do it?
Did you do it?
Yeah.
Like, who did it? We need to find out who did it. And so there's all the spies go out. Everybody's feeling around. Nobody's really got the sense that anybody knows what's happened. And that's when people get really scared because you suddenly realize, well, maybe it's an external threat. And if it's something else and we're fighting each other, we're not going to last long.
So was there an accord?
There was. The Treaty of Thronehold, which was signed in 996.
Hey, that's when I graduated from high school.
996, and which was the event that ended the war. It took a short amount of time, relatively months, I guess, to have the forces meet. There was a great deal of indecision about where to meet. They still couldn't agree, even at that point. But ultimately they did, to meet on this small island in Sion Sound, which is kind of a point on the map of Corvair where the 5 nations kind of touch, or they come very close to one another.
Okay.
All the nations get there fairly quickly except Ondair. And so delegates met on the island of Thronehold, which was the seat of power for King Jarrott before he died.
Oh, so it was like the old capital city.
Exactly. They gathered there and they signed the Treaty of Thronehold. And the Treaty of Thronehold not only said, we, the remaining 4 nations of the 5 nations, end hostilities at once. We also recognize ourselves as distinct nations going forward. And we also recognize the existence of other nations in Corvair besides us. The Valinor elves needed to be calmed down, so they got a nation, and it was officially recognized in the Treaty of Thronehold. The goblins, the goblin kind of Dakan, also got acknowledged. The gnomes of Zilargo, the dwarves of the Moror Holds, all of these nations got recognized as now their own nations. So what that did is that allayed fears from the dwarves that they would be annexed. That allayed fears from the gnomes that they would be annexed, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so it basically painted the map of Corvair with a bunch of more extra nations in addition to the 4 surviving one. The Mournland, of course, was and is a wasteland that nobody can lay claim to. House Orion's pissed off because it's cut off. It's basically cut a route, a lightning rail route.
Can't go through there anymore.
Can't go through there anymore.
Yeah.
And so, but the war ended with the Treaty of Thronehold. So far, the treaty is holding, but there's a Cold War that has begun to play out now. Spies are still wondering what happened to Sire. There's enough blame to go around. There's lots of hatred and tension that exists. The fact that the 5 leaders didn't really solve their problem, the thing that started the war.
Yeah.
They didn't come to any agreement. They didn't unify the kingdom of Galifar. They basically said, we'll stay in our separate kingdoms for now. Has created a great deal of unrest. And there's lots of people with theories about who's to blame for this horrific event. And displaced Sirens who were not in the country of origin when they lost it, who are still roaming around.
And they're not recognized as
They're not recognized as a nation, and a lot of people don't want them.
Because they somehow blame them for what
Exactly. Happened. And then you've got the added problem of, we made all these soldiers to fight in a war, and now we don't know what to do with them.
I was just going to ask, are they mentioned in the Treaty of Thronehold?
No.
Interesting.
No, it does not acknowledge them. What the treaty did do is it did say you can't have warforged slaves.
Okay.
But that's it.
They just said that they're not property. They're
sentient. They're not a nation. And we had talked previously before about an individual warforged named the Lord of Blades who takes umbrage with that and feels like the warforged should be a nation, possibly the only nation, since they fought the war.
Right.
Ultimately, in his mind, and so there's that lingering.
There's a development.
Yeah, there's a development there.
Well, what you've described is a continent that is rife with adventure.
Yes. And intrigue.
And intrigue.
Yes.
Which I like that too. I don't think I think we've mentioned intrigue, but now I'm like really, that's what's the major mystery is what happened 2 years ago and who was to blame and how can we use that to my nation's advantage, really.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah. That's a good way to go. You can get a really good campaign out of that.
As well as maybe independent, when we talk about researchers and universities that might be out there who are searching also for this, just for the sake of truth.
Yes. And then there are little things that you can just sort of tug on. Like, for instance, during the settling after the Treaty of Thronehold, a city that used to be part of Aundair was basically annexed by Thrain. Aundair wants that city back. That still doesn't sit well with them. So
the border was not drawn in a way that they
exactly. So these border disputes are out there. The fact that there is a nation that is emerging now, the nation of Droam, which is the sort of a nation of monsters, that feels like it should have been defined as a nation, but wasn't in the treaty.
So the Goblinoid was, but not this one. Is that the one that's run by Hag?
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yeah. So they're a little prickly about that. So there's all kinds of prickly little barbs.
I know. I think you almost did like 3, 4, 5, 6 different Lure You Should Know topics within here that we'll have to go deeper into.
Right.
That was a great overview of what's happening after the last war. Thank you.
You're welcome.
How can people ask you some questions if they might have it on social media?
I am on Twitter at Chris Perkins DND.
Excellent. I look forward to hearing more about what's happening with Eberron Rising from the Last War. And it comes out on November 19th, 2019.
Not too far at all.
It's very close. I see. I'll see if you will rise from the last war. Dun, dun, dun. Dun, dun, dun. All right. Thanks a lot. We'll be back with more lore soon. We only got about 15 minutes. I don't know if we will be able to squeeze in another one. What do you think?
Well, we only talked about doing like maybe 3 of the Dragon Marked houses. So maybe not take that long.
Okay. Let's do it then.
I don't know which 3 you want to do, but I think what are good ones? To some extent, we've actually already kind of talked about a couple of them, but
yeah, but I don't know. Is there more depth to go into each?
Possibly. Yes. I mean, we can just talk about them in general and just.
Yeah, because you mentioned the dragon prophecy thing too, and I was like, I'm not sure if maybe is that a better 13.
We can talk about the dragon prophecy.
Yeah. Okay. You want to do that?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. We're gonna do that then.
The draconic prophecy.
Ready when you are, Mr. Ryan.